Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Say Yes to Life, where we learn to embrace our Catholic faith in this secular world. I'm your host, Peter Rain, Senior Fellow for the Center for Christian Virtue, and welcome to show number 441 as we continue the fight for every single human life, born, preborn, and yours in our world today. Today's show, I'm excited to welcome a good friend, Dr. Alicia Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a board-certified OBGYN with a passion for helping women and couples with their reproductive health. Her practice specializes in natural family planning and restorative reproductive medicine, offering hope to women experiencing infertility and other gynecological challenges. A veteran of the Air Force and former fellow of the CDC, she also holds a master's in public health. Outside of her practice, Dr. Thompson is a dedicated advocate for the pro-life movement, volunteering at 2 local pregnancy resource centers and serving on the board of Ohio Right to Life, where I got to know her well. A happy and busy homeschooling mom, Dr. Thompson has 6 children. Dr. Thompson and I will be talking about her life and in vitro fertilization, or more commonly known as IVF today. It's going to be a really important show. I was talking with Sean, producer, before the show here, and the reality that only 3 to 7% of these embryonic children make it through the IVF process alive. So you might even have family members. And look, we're not doing this show out of judgment or anything of that nature. We just want the truth to kind of get out there about IVF and what's involved in the process. We understand and appreciate that there's people that want to have kids, and that's a good and beautiful and holy desire. But it's also important we understand the processes that we undergo to have children. What's best for those children in the long run? What's best for our country as well? But first, let's go ahead and take 180 seconds around Ohio and the nation to talk about what's happening in the pro-life movement and the news. First, sad news. Dr. James Dobson has died. Dr. James C. Dobson was one of the most influential Christian leaders of the last half century. He's a tireless advocate for the traditional family. He passed away on August 21st, today, at the age of 89. He was a psychologist, a New York Times bestselling author, a Radio Hall of Fame broadcaster, and advisor to 5 U.S. presidents. Can't imagine advising 5 U.S. presidents. I mean, that's pretty important. But Dr. Dobson dedicated his life to strengthening marriages, guiding parents, and defending biblical values by championing the central role of family in America. My kids are actually listening right now to Adventures in Odyssey. All this stuff comes from Focus on the Family. He was instrumental in forming the Family Policy Council, of which CCV is a part, alongside former CCV board chairman and Focus on the Family Vice President Tom Minery. May perpetual light shine upon him, and the merciful arms of Jesus Christ now embrace Dr. James Dobson. All right, second, a Chinese company, this is shocking to me, but a Chinese company claims to have created a robot that can carry a baby in the womb to birth, from conception to birth, from live action. Scientists in China are allegedly creating pregnancy robots that will be capable of carrying human babies to term and then giving birth. The pregnancy robot, created by Kaiwa Technology, is expected to be released next year with a selling price of about $13,000 US. Founder Zane Kiffen said he hopes the robot will be able to replicate pregnancy from fertilization onwards, and claims his device is not an incubator, but a humanoid with an artificial uterus. The future, friends, it's here, and the future is very scary. That's why we need things like the Essential Summit, October 2nd in Columbus. Join us as we have David Bereit from the Pro-Life Leadership Conference, Professor Lee Strain of Ohio State University, Dr. Carl Truman, Attorney General David Yost, Willie Robertson from Duck Dynasty, and other speakers to talk about faith, family, freedom, artificial intelligence, the pro-life movement, all those things. You can find out more information at essentialsummit.org. Now, the very next day is the March for Life in downtown Columbus. You can find out more at marchforlife.org/Ohio, as thousands of pro-lifers join to March for Life. And then finally, the week preceding that in Cleveland, if you're in the Cleveland area, listen on the Rock up there in Cleveland, we have Charlie Kirk is coming in September 26th for the Cleveland Gala. Would love to have you there. You can find out more information again at ccv.org. All right, now on today's show, as we're excited to welcome Dr. Alicia Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a board-certified OBGYN with a passion for helping women and couples with their reproductive health. She's a happy and busy homeschooling mom besides the practice that she has, and Dr. Thompson has 6 children. Alicia, so good to have you on the show. Welcome back to Say Yes to Life.
Oh, thanks to you. It's an honor to be back, Peter. Good to speak with you again.
Amen. Well, it's been since I think December 2023 since we had you on the show. So maybe we can remind some of our listeners a little bit about your background and introduce you for the first time to some of our new listeners on the Ave Maria Radio Network up in Michigan. So if you wouldn't mind, just share a little bit about your life journey and what brought you to eventually practicing medicine.
Sure. The practicing medicine was a pretty easy one to answer when I was a little kid. Somebody asked me once, as we do to little kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, a doctor, I guess. And I just kind of stuck with it. And fortunately, as I got older, I liked sciences. My dad was in the military, graduated from University of Florida in chemistry, and thought, what do I want to do with my life? And tried to decide. And ultimately, after working as a research fellow at the CDC, I decided to go into medical school. And I did that on an Air Force scholarship, and that paid for my medical school. And I ended up here in Ohio, where I completed my residency on active duty as an OBGYN. And my faith journey is probably my favorite story to tell about how God rescues us. But when I came to Ohio, I was a very pro-choice OBGYN, had intentions to train in abortion, and it was through my encountering of patients in my job and some other things that aligned that I had a deep conversion experience from agnosticism to Christianity, and then very in short order to Catholicism. And if you had asked me, when I was 25 years old, would I've ever envisioned my life as being a pro-life advocate, I would never have seen that. But God authors all things well if you just follow after him. And here I am today talking to you.
Oh, it's beautiful. Have you ever been on the journey home with the Grodi family?
I was on it a few years ago. Yes, I kind of kept it under wraps because I just, private. But I married into a huge Catholic family,
Yeah.
and one of my husband's aunts saw it somehow and put it on blast. So few people have seen it. I did it a few years ago. Yes.
Well, you've been exposed here on Siesta Life. Your story's now going to get out there. That's fantastic. I mean, John Mark's a good friend of mine, and so I was just like, the light bulbs went off. I'm like, we got to have her on Journey Home. But you've already been there. He's already discovered you, which is fantastic, and it's just amazing. You mentioned I was a pro-choice OBGYN. I'm like, knowing you now, I'm like, there's no way. But that's the work of God. That's how amazing God is. He'll take us where we're at, and he'll bring us to places maybe we never imagined before. But let's go ahead and let's dive into in vitro fertilization. There's a lot to cover on this topic. It's commonly known as IVF. And, look, I've sat down with people in coffee shops and, just catching up with them on life, and they've shared with me, and they otherwise to me would have been someone who, kind of fully practicing Catholic. They're going to mass every weekend and everything of that nature. And then they just kind of drop the bombshell. Oh yeah. And then we're going to start IVF soon. And so, it doesn't shock me anymore when I hear that somebody's going through that process. And, again, having had friends go through the process, I'm not sitting here from a judgmental perspective, but I am sitting here from a perspective that there is truth, and we need to get the truth out there. So let's just start with the basics, though. The who, what, when, and how of IVF. So what is IVF? When did it start? Like, who created it? And then how common is the practice today?
Oh, yeah, great questions. So, and I also echo what you said. You don't sit in judgment. As an OBGYN, I encounter so many patients and couples who struggle with infertility, which is one of the most difficult diagnoses for couples to experience. It's very tender, and I think any of us can understand the desperation that people experiencing infertility can sometimes feel, and the avenues that they'll pursue when available to them. So again, also not to sit in judgment of others, but just to talk about what IVF is as a process. The first baby born from IVF was named Louise Brown, and she was born in 1978. IVF as a process came about, slowly in the 1960s and really into fruition into the 1970s, and became very widely available in the 1980s. And it's just been a very honed craft since then. Initially, it started with things what we would call tubal infertility, where the female's fallopian tubes were obliterated or had been destroyed for some reason by ectopic pregnancies or endometriosis. And what people realized with these couples was like, well, Louise Brown's parents could not get pregnant because the sperm and the egg could not meet because they meet in the tube. So what they did over time was learn how to extract eggs from a woman's ovary And it took a lot of time and detail to figure out you just can't pull them out at any time. You have to pull them out when the eggs are ripe and ready to be fertilized. And then the eggs that have been retrieved are going to be put into, basically a medium with sperm so that the sperm can fertilize those eggs through natural means, just general penetration of the outside zona pellucida, and fertilize the egg. And now you have a single-celled zygote, which is a human embryo. And those embryos then, depending on how many are made, typically one will be placed back into the uterine cavity, into the endometrium, where the desire for that act is that the embryo would implant into the uterus, the embryo would continue to grow, and you would end up having a live birth. And that is effectively what IVF is in a nutshell.
So these children, they're created kind of in a dish, in a petri dish, right? I mean, they're just kind of placed. They fertilize. How soon does a child need to be implanted before it needs to be either discarded or frozen? I mean, how soon would it die if it's not implanted?
Well, that's a great question. And there is a scientific moratorium in the United States where we say that embryos are not allowed to be grown in culture beyond 14 days. So we do have embryos that are grown in culture up to 14 days. That is a U.S. requirement. That is not known, or that is not a requirement internationally. So the biggest issue that we have is how do you grow them in medium at some point? They need to be able to be supported by structures outside of the material that they're in. They need to develop a placenta and all the things that come with life. But interestingly, if you're going to use them for testing, you can keep them out. But if you're going to have these embryos, and I hate to use the word use, but this is how it is. If you're going to discard them or use them for science, you can keep them in a culture for 2 weeks legally. But if you're going to use them for grow into a baby, that's what these couples are wanting, you need to put them in sometimes as early as 3 days, but sometimes as late as 5 days. But that is after their fertilization point. So once they're fertilized, they are being babysat by what we call like an embryologist. So what happens in the main life of IVF is that the female, the woman, undergoes these more invasive procedures. So typically when women are naturally ovulating, we ovulate one egg at a time. Mm-hmm. But for example, a 30-year-old woman, on the third day of her period, she may actually have 15 or 30 eggs available to ovulate that very cycle that she's in, but only one will make it. The vast bulk of them are lost in the ovulation process. So what IVF is hoping to do in egg retrievals is rather than losing the 15 or 20 eggs, they will retrieve all of them. They will make this woman super ovulate. And so she'll have, rather than one dominant egg, one ripe egg, as we would say, she would have 15 or 20. And all of those eggs would be retrieved on a procedure where they literally go take a needle in and out of every single cyst, and they use like a suction to draw the egg through like a tube. And then an embryologist on the other side can say, oh, yeah, we got an egg, we got an egg, we got an egg. And then they count the eggs. They split the eggs up, and all of the eggs that are retrieved would then be fertilized if this is an IVF cycle. You can stop at that point. So once the eggs are retrieved, this is the difference between IVF and ART. ART stands for Assisted Reproductive Technologies. So not all ART is IVF. So very commonly now, as you know in your professional career and mine, doctors, lawyers, executives oftentimes will delay childbearing, and these women can retrieve the eggs and then freeze them at that stage. And that's one part of IVF, like an earlier step, and you can stop there. But otherwise, if you're trying to have a baby this cycle, they would fertilize all the eggs. And they could fertilize 20 eggs or 25 eggs. And then what they do is they look in the embryology lab to see if these eggs are now embryos. And how do they know that? They know within 24 hours, because if it is a living human cell, which is now a human being, a single-celled zygote, they divide. And so they look at these embryos under the microscope and can determine that they're alive based on the fact that they are growing. They are doing the things that living organisms do. They adapt, they reproduce, they divide their cells, and they're metabolizing energy. And they watch them, and sometime around day 3 or 5, they grade the embryos. And they look at them and say, how fragmented are they? Do these look healthy? Do the cells look like they're developing normally? Do the cells look fragmented? And they give a grade. The highest grade embryos would be, generally those are the ones that would be set aside for use. Lower grade embryos can also be set aside for use, but it's almost like a tiering system. So the higher level embryos are the ones who are most likely to be chosen for implantation. But almost invariably at this point, it's a single embryo that would be transferred in, and any remaining embryos would be frozen for later use.
Wow. So, gosh, just describing the process, immediately, ethical concerns are going off for me. So you have the baby who is created outside of, outside the woman's body. And so maybe not necessarily the best place for a child to be created in a dish. You would think that there's a whole slew of chemical related side effects that come from what you're describing as a super ovulation for the woman. But then you have this multiple eggs that are created, sometimes 15, and you're grading the embryos, which is just a eugenics process saying, all right, these embryos are stronger, these are not as strong. So we're going to choose the stronger human beings to give them a chance, and the other ones are going to be discarded or frozen. But I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on, from a Catholic perspective, ethical concerns, and then also from a secular perspective with using IVF. I mean, there might be somebody who's not Catholic says, okay, well, I don't agree with those Catholic principles, sex needs to be unitive and so on and so forth. But so maybe you could walk us through what are the major ethical concerns, both from a Catholic perspective, but also a secular perspective as well with using IVF.
Sure. I think from a Catholic perspective, it's pretty simple in that we are blessed by the judgment and discernment of the Church as instructed by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So we know that children should be conceived in a sexual act, the sexual embrace by the husband and wife, and that is the great blessing of the sexual act in marriage. And though you receive those children gratefully from the Lord. So any action, as we know, that divides that and would involve third-party reproduction, handling of gametes, selection of things like that, is more of a intentionally creative process of human design rather than God Himself, and that is something that is not good for marriages, I would generally say, and can be very difficult for couples as well. But we can understand why, when couples are experiencing infertility, why they may veer away from church teaching and go through this route, because as you said so beautifully in the beginning, the desire to have a family is so good, it's so holy, it's so natural, and it is one of the greatest blessings that we can receive outside of our salvation is the blessing of children. I mean, you get to, I always joke, but I'm not really joking. I don't know really what it means when we go to heaven that we're not married anymore. I can't imagine that as a married person, what that would look like. And God willing, my husband and I will go to heaven, and God willing, our children will meet us there. And if I'm not married to my husband anymore, whatever that may look like, our children will be a permanent visual representation of our marriage in heaven. That's an incredible blessing. That's just, you can't even describe the depth of that experience as a couple when you think about that as a reality of your marriage. So when couples don't experience that, is a profound, profound loss and a deprivation. So this is oftentimes why couples, regardless even of their worldview, religious or secular, will frequently go down a pathway of assisted reproductive technology. And I think that as an OBGYN, where I meet so many couples suffering from this and who don't share my worldview, I still think that you can help these couples journey through a process that you may not necessarily wish that they would go down, but to help them formulate an idea of what the process is and to understand the abuses that can occur and how to best avoid them, to kind of streamline it to where you're like, can we do this in a way that's not so utilitarian? I think arguably we would say as Catholics, IVF by itself is utilitarian. It's taking genetic material and combining them in a dish, and then knowing in the process that a huge percentage of the embryos, as you said, 95% of them will not make it to live birth in a year. So that we are knowingly going into a process that's so wasteful of human life in order to achieve the beautiful goal of having children. So you and I would both know in Catholic theology, the ends do not justify the means.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
that's really difficult. But I think even couples that are secular can understand the ethical dilemma that couples can experience when I have patients I've cared for who have more than 30 frozen embryos, more than
Wow.
30.
Wow.
And that's for many, many people, secular, that can be an ethical conundrum. Nobody cries about the egg and nobody cries about the sperm. These are human beings. That's the difference. They're not gametes that we're talking about. They are single cell human embryos. And it creates a very difficult and fraught experience that people don't know what to do with what are called supernumerary embryos when they're made intentionally in excess in a utilitarian way to allow the couple to have as many children as they want, and in fact, more children than they could possibly ever have in some certain circumstances. And, it's kind of my job for those patients that come to me and they're going to go down that pathway to educate on what the process looks like, because once you're in it, it just seems normal, that just
Mm-hmm.
this is what they do, this is the next step. And can you offer agency to them? Can you say, I don't want this part of the step? And that's one of my jobs as an educator.
So, United States, the practicing of in vitro fertilization, does it look similar in other countries? Are there some differences or maybe some practices that, we could look to in, say, countries like Germany or Italy that are different than the United States that could maybe point us towards at least some guidelines? Maybe they won't be fully Catholic guidelines, but there'll be at least some guardrails on this issue for us, which is really feels like it's the wild, wild west here in the United States. There's absolutely no regulations on IVF.
That's right. We have very limited, almost no national regulations whatsoever. We do leave it up to the states. Louisiana has been one of the more conservative states regarding IVF. Certainly there was that since I talked to you last, I think it was in February of 2024, where there was that Alabama Supreme Court case on, the legal status of human embryos and can they be viewed if there's been some sort of negligence occurring in an IVF clinic that the parents of those embryos could sue regarding the destruction of their embryos. Well, these are really important ethical questions that we're grappling with now. But as you said, other countries are doing different things. So, for example, in Germany, you are not allowed to fertilize, meaning you are not allowed to take sperm and put them with the egg for more eggs than you're willing to implant. So, for example, if you're not going to transfer 4 embryos into a woman, we're not going to try to help this woman have quadruplets, well, you're not allowed to fertilize 4 eggs then. So if you're willing to transfer 2 embryos, you can fertilize 2 eggs. Or if you're only willing to transfer in 1 embryo, you're only allowed to fertilize 1 egg. So one of the things, though, that people would say is that, well, we don't want women to have to go through this IVF process over and over and over again because of the risk to it. And I think that that is a fair thing to say. IVF, this is a surgical procedure to remove the eggs. As you said, the hormonal status that these women can experience when they're super ovulating can actually be very risky for them. They can have something called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which in certain cases can, land women in the hospital. They're so ill. And sadly, even if they want to have embryos transferred, sometimes they're so sick that they will freeze all the embryos because that woman is too sick, if you will. She's too unstable from the superovulation to even put in an embryo right then. You have to wait for the whole process to kind of calm down in her body before she'll be more receptive to any of the embryos that you've created. Well, Germany doesn't let you do that. You can pull out all the eggs that you want, but you're only allowed to fertilize as many as you are willing to put back. So then what they do there is any remaining eggs, if you got out 20, you fertilize 1, and then you freeze the remaining eggs. A good question would be, well, are those eggs as good? Is it better to fertilize them fresh? And I think that we do know through lots of data that freezing eggs is successful. We do freeze eggs, and we have them, and greater than 90% will yield and be capable of fertilizing if they were good quality eggs when they were frozen to begin with, or they're not basically being destroyed in the fertilization process. The other argument that would be made, though, is that obviously if you think of IVF as a process to children, well, An egg isn't an embryo. An embryo has already shown you that this is closer to a baby in your arms. So it is a very utilitarian view in that way, but Germany, I think, is doing it right in that we're not freezing embryos, which have a very different moral status. They are freezing eggs. And, most of us don't feel that there's any moral status to a female's egg.
So IVF ultimately, with this kind of genetic disposition, we're choosing the strongest embryos and everything. It's leading to the contribution that's commodifying the human being. Yet it remains very popular. I mean, most people, when it's pulled on it, they're for IVF. They approve it in public. But maybe most of the public doesn't know what's actually happening in the IVF process. So thanks for explaining it to us today. What should we be doing in the pro-life movement practically? And maybe part of that practical is sharing those alternatives to IVF, or even from a legislative side, if you want to address it from that perspective, to bring awareness or to curtail the dangers which you've enumerated about IVF.
Sure. I think one of the things that I've not covered that I think really deserves some legislation is the process of what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnoses. So this is a step where once the embryo has been created through IVF, they can take one of the cells, so they put a needle in through the outer egg wall of the embryo, where the embryo is living still inside the mother's egg. They can take a cell out, they can amplify the DNA, and do genetic testing on the embryo. So this allows for couples to decide if they are going to transfer embryos that have, quote-unquote, normal DNA. Embryos that are abnormal can be set aside or allowed to expire. They actually can use genetic testing as well to choose things. I'm not making this up. In California, there's IVF clinics that will let you choose the eye color of your offspring. They'll let you choose the gender. So if you want to have a boy, Paris Hilton, for example, I think she very famously a couple of years ago said she had gone through IVF, like 7 IVF cycles, because all of her embryos, there were like 20 of them, they were all boys, and she wanted a girl. So she kept making embryos in order to get a girl and discarding the boys.